I always imagined my graduation day would sound like thunderous applause. That when they called my name, Grace Monroe, summa cum laude policy and social reform, my parents would rise first clapping before anyone else beaming with pride, maybe even crying. I thought I'd find their faces in the crowd, a mix of joy, disbelief, and love, and I would smile back proud of myself and proud to finally give them a reason to believe in me. Instead, when my name echoed across the university green, there was a beat of silence, a hollow second, and then polite applause from strangers. I looked up. The seat I'd reserved for them, row D, section B, was still empty. At first, I told myself maybe they were late. Traffic, maybe, a flat tire, something, something that would make sense. But when I reached the stage, shaking the dean's hand and accepting my diploma, I already knew. They weren't coming. I found out why 10 minutes later while standing under a white graduation tent trying not to smudge my makeup. My phone buzzed with a photo from my mom. A backyard grill, plastic chairs, neighbors holding red cups. The caption, Monroe Family BBQ is officially on. No mention of me, no good luck, no so proud. Just chicken skewers and potato salad. That moment, standing in my cap and gown alone in a sea of families, was when something inside me snapped. Not with anger, not even sadness. It was quieter than that, like a soft click, the sound of a door I didn't realize I could close, gently shutting behind me. Long before that graduation tent, I'd already learned how to disappear quietly. At home, I was never the loud one, not the problem child, not the star athlete. I was the middle ground, the girl who remembered her lunchbox, got her homework done, and never needed a parent-teacher conference. That sounds like a blessing until you realize it meant no one really noticed you at all. When I was 7, I won a school art contest for a painting of a girl holding up a flashlight in the dark. It was hung in the local library, and I asked Mom if she wanted to come see it with me. She glanced up from folding laundry and said, "That's cute, honey. But maybe next weekend." We never went. At 10, I earned a certificate for reading the most books in my grade. The school librarian hugged me, beaming. My parents said I was such a little nerd at dinner, then changed the subject to my brother's Little League win. I smiled and nodded, learning to tuck pride away like a secret diary. By high school, I stopped telling them about awards altogether. It felt easier not to hope. When my guidance counselor called me Ivy League material, I laughed it off. We both knew my family wasn't built for big dreams. Looking back, I don't think they meant harm. They were just busy surviving Dad with his double shifts at the auto shop, Mom keeping the house running and everyone fed. But somewhere in the noise of survival, my quiet voice never stood a chance. The thing is, when you grow up in the background, you become really good at performing for approval, even if no one's watching. You learn to cheer for yourself in empty rooms. You celebrate in whispers. You convince yourself that maybe love is just something you have to earn harder. But that belief, it lingers. It followed me to college, into every exam room, every internship application, every late-night study session with burning eyes and ramen dinners. I was still chasing a nod of approval that might never come. And deep down, I think I always believed that if I could just cross that graduation stage, if I could just prove I was worth showing up for, things would finally change. But as we both know, they didn't. Which brings me to the next part of this story, not about school, but about survival of another kind. Let me tell you what it was like to study in silence when the only applause came from within. When I arrived at Georgetown, I was carrying more than just a duffel bag and twin XL sheets. I brought years of silence with me. It was the kind of silence you learn to live with when your victories go unnoticed. The kind that teaches you to whisper your hopes and apologize when you succeed. It stayed with me in every classroom seat I took, every library corner I claimed. I never expected college to be easy, but I hadn't anticipated the loneliness that came from working so hard with no one watching. My freshman year schedule became a delicate dance. I took early morning classes so I could work evening shifts at a campus cafe. Weekends were spent tutoring local high school students or running errands for a professor who let me sit in on graduate seminars in exchange. Sleep was a luxury. Meals were whatever I could grab between shifts and study groups. No one at home asked how it was going, no one sent care packages, but I kept showing up. I learned how to celebrate quietly. Acing an economics midterm meant treating myself to a hot sandwich instead of cold leftovers. Finishing a policy paper on time felt like winning a silent war. Each victory was private, but it mattered. There's a strange strength in studying in silence. When no one claps for you, you learn to clap for yourself. You learn to measure progress by the inches only you can see. And in a world that glorifies validation, that's a deeply underrated kind of power. Still, It wasn't all isolation. Somewhere between long hours and low expectations, I met others like me, fellow students who also carried silence in their bones. We formed a quiet circle of shared ambition. We traded study tips and frozen dinners, wrote each other notes before exams, and reminded one another that we weren't crazy for wanting more. But even then, I never fully stopped hoping that maybe, just maybe one day, I'd get a call from home that said, "We're proud of you." That day never came. Instead, the only call I got after graduation wasn't about pride at all. It was about money. And that changed everything. Words don't always need to be cruel to leave scars. Sometimes it's the offhanded remarks, the shrug, the sarcasm, the silence that stay with you the longest. I don't think my parents ever meant to hurt me, but they didn't need to try in order to succeed. I remember once during junior year of college, I called home excited because I'd been selected for a competitive fellowship, something only 5 undergrads received each year. I was beaming, waiting to hear pride in their voices. Instead, my dad said, "That's great, but don't get a big head. Degrees don't pay the rent." My mom added, "Just don't forget to budget. You know how you get with money." It wasn't rage. It wasn't insult. It was doubt. Quiet, consistent doubt. The kind that eats away at you like dripping water on stone. And after years of hearing things like, "Don't overthink, don't act too smart, or you're not better than anyone else," I started to believe that being ambitious was something I needed to apologize for. It shaped how I spoke about my dreams. I learned to soften my voice when I talked about law school. I downplayed my achievements so they didn't sound like bragging. I coached myself out of confidence before anyone else could. The truth is, we often internalize our family's language before we realize it's happening. We inherit their fears, their insecurities, their limitations, and sometimes we wear them like hand-me-downs even when they don't quite fit. But one thing college did teach me, and not through a textbook, is that worth isn't something anyone else gets to define for you. It took time, but I started to reframe their words. I stopped hearing "don't get ahead of yourself" as a warning and started seeing it as a reflection of their own ceilings, not mine. That shift was small, but it mattered. It created space between their story and mine. And I would need that space more than ever when the call finally came, not to say "we're proud of you," but to ask for something else entirely. It came 3 days after graduation. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my half-packed apartment, surrounded by open boxes and empty coffee mugs, when my phone buzzed. Dad, the screen read. I stared at it for a few seconds, not because I was busy, but because I was surprised. He hadn't called in months. A small part of me lit up. Maybe this was it. Maybe they'd finally realized what that moment had meant. Maybe they'd seen my name announced online or heard from someone in town. Maybe they were going to say they were proud. I picked up quickly, trying not to sound too eager. "Hi, Dad." He started with small talk. "How's the packing? How's the weather in DC? When's the new job starting?" I answered politely, waiting. Then, like someone slowly removing a cover from something they'd been hiding, he got to the real reason. "So listen, we've had a bit of a situation," he said. "The dishwasher overflowed and flooded the kitchen. The plumber says there's damage under the floor. They're talking 3, maybe 4,000 to fix it. We're a little strapped at the moment. We were hoping you might be able to help out." No congratulations, no mention of graduation, just a request for money casually delivered like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat there stunned, not just by the ask, but by how familiar it felt. This wasn't the first time they'd needed help. Even as a student working 2 jobs, I'd sent money now, and then groceries, gas, a utility bill here and there. But this felt different. This wasn't an emergency. This wasn't survival. This was entitlement. And suddenly I saw it for what it was: a pattern. A pattern where my efforts were invisible, but my income, or even just the idea of it, was always up for grabs. A pattern where I wasn't the daughter they celebrated, but the one they could always turn to when things broke down. I wanted to scream, but instead I just said quietly, "Dad, I haven't even gotten my first paycheck yet." He sighed. "Well, you've got that graduation money from your professors, don't you? And you've always been good with budgeting. You'll figure it out." That night, I didn't cry, I didn't argue. Instead, I felt something shift. A slow, quiet closing of a chapter. I realized that I'd spent years trying to earn love that came with conditions or came only when I was useful. And I made a decision. Maybe it was time to start over. Not just in work, but in life. Somewhere new where I could build something that belonged fully to me. Because if they couldn't show up for my wins, they didn't get to cash in on them either. There's a quiet kind of power in choosing your own beginning. A week after that call with my dad, I booked a one-way ticket to Boston. My new job, a junior policy analyst for a housing justice nonprofit, didn't start for another 3 weeks, but I emailed my future supervisor, explained my situation, and asked if I could begin early. Her reply came within hours. Absolutely, we'd love to have you sooner. Let us know your arrival date. We'll arrange housing for your first 2 weeks. That was the moment it clicked. I didn't need to wait for someone else's permission anymore. The move itself wasn't glamorous. I had 2 suitcases, a secondhand laptop, and a box of books I couldn't leave behind. My furniture was a fold-out air mattress and a thrift store lamp. But when I stepped into that tiny sublet on the third floor of a creaky brownstone, I felt something I'd never felt before: peace. It wasn't about square footage or city views. It was about ownership, not of property, but of space. Space I didn't have to shrink in. Space where my voice didn't echo back unheard. Space where I made the rules. Each decision, no matter how small, where to put the mug rack, what playlist to wake up to, which grocery store had the best cheap produce, was mine. And slowly those decisions built a rhythm, a life. Of course it wasn't easy. Rent was high, even by Boston standards. My salary was modest. I learned to stretch every dollar, swap dinners out for lentil soup, and hunt Craigslist listings like it was a second job. But even in those frugal moments, I never felt poor. Because for the first time, my life was being built from intention, not obligation. I started waking up early not because I had to, but because I wanted those quiet moments before work. I joined a community book club. I said yes to after-hours policy panels and networking coffees even when I felt out of place. I was tired most days, but it was the kind of tired that comes from planting, not from carrying. And in the middle of it all, I started to notice something unexpected. I no longer felt like I was running from something. I was finally running towards something. That clarity made the next chapter possible, the one where for the first time, my parents reached back out. But not to say we miss you. They came with a business proposal. 3 months into my new life in Boston, I got a text from my mom that simply said, "Can we visit you next month? We found cheap flights." For a moment, my heart fluttered. Maybe this was it, the olive branch. The overdue "we're sorry" wrapped in a weekend trip. I imagined showing them my little apartment, introducing them to my team at work, walking them through the Boston Commons with stories they'd never taken the time to ask about. I told myself maybe things had changed. I was wrong. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, dragging worn luggage and a long list of complaints: the airline, the weather, the cost of everything. But I smiled, made reservations, played tour guide. I was still hoping. Saturday evening over dinner at a quiet seafood place, it happened. My dad leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was sharing a family secret. "Grace, you remember Johnson from my crew? His brother-in-law is launching a property startup flipping houses. Small scale, they need investors, just 5 grand to start." My fork froze midair. My mom chimed in, "You've always been so good with numbers, you could help manage the paperwork. It'd be a family thing." That's when it hit me: they hadn't come to reconnect. They came to recruit. I looked at them, really looked, and realized they didn't know my job title. They didn't ask about my team or my first solo policy report. They hadn't mentioned graduation or my apartment or anything beyond what I might be able to give. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. But instead, I just asked quietly, "Is that why you came?" Their silence was answer enough. That night, I sat on my window ledge looking out at the city lights and reminded myself of something I had forgotten: not every open door is an invitation to walk back into a pattern that hurt you. We want so badly to believe people come back because they miss us, not what we can do for them. But when someone returns with a pitch instead of an apology, it's not reconciliation, it's recruitment. That weekend taught me one of the hardest truths sometimes. The people who raised you aren't ready to see who you've become. Not because they don't love you, but because your growth challenges the version of you they're still holding on to. And when that happens, the only path forward is a loving but firm boundary, which is exactly what I was about to set next. The next morning, over lukewarm hotel coffee, I looked at my parents and knew I couldn't pretend anymore. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse, but I did something far harder. I told the truth. I need to say something. I began, voice calm but steady. It hurt when you missed my graduation. It hurt even more when your first call afterward wasn't to celebrate, it was to ask for money. And now, after 3 months of silence, you're here not because you wanted to see me, but because you need something again. They both shifted uncomfortably. My dad said something about just trying to include me in an opportunity. My mom added, "You're taking this too personally," but I didn't back down. "I've spent years twisting myself into versions that might earn your approval," I said softly. "I won't do that anymore. I love you. But I'm not available for transactions." If we're going to rebuild anything, it has to be built on who I am now, not just what I can give. They didn't respond. Not really. My dad mumbled something about respect, and my mom busied herself stirring cream into a coffee she never drank. But I knew I hadn't failed. I'd spoken with honesty, and for the first time in my life, I hadn't apologized for it. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care deeply enough to protect what you've worked so hard to grow. That weekend, I arranged a car to the airport for them. I didn't ask if they enjoyed the visit. I didn't follow up with a thank you text. I let it end where it needed to end, not in bitterness, but in clarity. Because real love isn't about access, it's about respect. And I finally respected myself enough to ask for it. What came after was a quieter season, not full of drama, not full of noise. But it was in that quiet that something surprising began to grow. Not from them, but from somewhere entirely new. After my parents left, I expected to feel relief, and I did. But what surprised me more was the stillness that followed. A kind of peace I hadn't known before. Without the constant tug of war for approval, I had room to just be. I started noticing the people who did show up. Like Jordan from work, who always saved me a seat in meetings and never forgot to ask how my week was going. Or my neighbor Maudie, who knocked on my door the night my faucet broke and said I brought brownies and a wrench. Which do you need first? Or my boss Karen, who pulled me aside after a tough presentation to say, "You have a voice that needs a room. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." These weren't grand gestures, but they were consistent. And consistent kindness, that's what builds a foundation. For the first time, I saw success not as a paycheck or a title or even a framed diploma. I saw it in community, in nights filled with mismatched chairs and homemade soup, in honest conversations over tea, in being asked for my opinion, not my labor. I began mentoring younger women through a local first-gen network girls who reminded me of myself at 17, unsure if they belonged in the spaces they'd earned. I told them, the room might not look like it was built for you, but your presence there is what makes it better. And I believed it. Success, I realized, wasn't proving people wrong. It was finding people who never needed convincing to begin with. And when the 1-year anniversary of my graduation came around, I didn't think about the chairs left empty. I thought about the ones that were filled by people who'd chosen to sit beside me. And that led to the final step in this story, the moment I finally stopped chasing something I never needed in the first place. For months, I kept the photo buried in a drawer. You know, the one me standing in cap and gown, the tassel just right holding my diploma case, like it weighed more than 4 years of exhaustion and hope. There's no family behind me, no balloons or flower bouquets. Just Lily, my old roommate from Georgetown, and her parents flanking me with arms wide and eyes proud. The smile on my face is real but tired. The kind you wear when your heart is doing something braver than it knows how to name. I didn't frame it at first because I thought it represented something missing. The absence, the letdown, the wound. But something shifted during that first year in Boston. As I slowly added pieces to my home, a bookshelf here, a thrifted armchair there, I realized the photo no longer hurt the way it used to. I didn't see what wasn't there anymore. I saw what was. I saw resilience, growth, the quiet, undeniable truth that I did it, without applause, without a cheering section, and still I did it. So I framed it. Hung it above my desk right next to a handwritten thank you note from one of the girls I now mentor. She wrote, "You made me feel seen for the first time." That's what healing can look like. Not forgetting the past, but reclaiming it, reframing it both literally and emotionally to reflect not what broke you, but what you built anyway. Sometimes we wait for love to arrive in the shape of the people who were supposed to give it, but sometimes love comes later through new voices, new spaces, and most powerfully, through our own. This journey from being invisible in my own childhood to building a life I no longer have to shrink inside taught me that walking alone doesn't mean you're failing. Sometimes walking alone is how you find your true direction. If you've ever had to choose between your peace and someone else's expectations, I see you. Maybe your graduation moment looked different. Maybe your milestones were celebrated only in silence. Or maybe you're still learning how to draw the line gently but firmly between love and self-preservation. Wherever you are on that journey, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, not just for me, but for the next person reading who needs to know they're not alone. If this story resonated with you, give it a like, subscribe for more real-life journeys, and consider sending it to someone who might need a quiet reminder that healing is possible and that walking away isn't always about leaving people behind, but about walking toward who you're becoming. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, keep building what's yours.